remember you.
Egon, move!
Hi guys, welcome back. Back in the 1980s, the Real Ghostbusters looked like a normal Saturday morning cartoon. You had Slimer causing chaos, the Ghostbusters making jokes, and colorful ghosts flying around New York City. But to be honest, once you actually sit down and rewatch some of these episodes, you realize this show was secretly horror for children. And then Extreme Ghostbusters came later and somehow pushed things even further. These cartoons introduced kids to closet monsters, dream demons, cursed transformations, ancient Halloween gods, and even full Lovecraftian cosmic horror. So today, we are not going to rank the funniest ghosts or the most iconic villain. We're going to talk specifically about the monsters that were genuinely terrifying through a child's eye. From the boogeyman in your closet to the literal spirit of Halloween, which cartoon ghost actually kept you up all night? The boogeyman. At number 1, we have the monster that traumatized an entire generation of kids. The Boogieman. Honestly, this thing felt less like a cartoon villain and more like something that escaped from an actual horror movie. Visually, the Boogieman was nightmare fuel from top to bottom. He was tall and skeletal with long and pale hair, huge pointed teeth, glowing eyes, goat-like legs, clawed hands, and this stretched goblin-like face that constantly looked hungry. The way he moved was also wrong sometimes. One second he moved slowly, and then suddenly the next second he was lunging. The animators made him feel deeply unnatural. But the real horror came from what he represented. The Boogeyman came out of children's closets, which is one of the most common childhood fears ever, and the show fully used that idea. Closet doors slowly opened in dark bedrooms, while this monster stepped out from another dimension to feed on fear. That alone was horrifying enough, but the episode made it even worse by revealing that Egon himself was traumatized by the Boogeyman as a child. And then suddenly the villain felt much more personal and threatening. The Boogeyman's world was also terrifying. It was this dark nightmare dimension filled with shadows, strange places, and constant fear. Nothing about it, to be honest, was safe or funny. One scene in particular had absolutely terrified the kids back then, which was the Boogeyman slowly stepping out of a child's closet into a dark bedroom. It played directly into one of the most common childhood fears ever. And honestly, that is why he remains one of the scariest Ghostbusters monsters ever, as the Boogeyman was not just about fighting the Ghostbusters. He was also invading the children's bedrooms and targeting the audience's imagination directly. Even today, it is easy to see why fans remember The Boogeyman Cometh as the episode that genuinely scared them as kids. The Sandman. The Sandman episode was terrifying because it weaponized something every human being has to do eventually, which is sleep. You can run from a monster, you can hide from a ghost, but at the end of the day, you eventually have to fall asleep. That idea alone made this episode very unsettling. Visually, the Sandman looked eerie and almost corpse-like, all pale-faced, glowing eyes, dark clothing that resembled a trench coat or a robe, and this calm, slow movement that somehow made him even scarier. He did not scream or rage, he simply walked through the city, spreading sleep everywhere he went. And once people fell asleep, the real horror began. The Sandman's powers allowed dreams to physically manifest into reality. Sudden, gigantic nightmare creatures began rampaging across New York City, while the population lay unconscious, and that scale of the disaster almost felt apocalyptic. As a child, this episode created a really uncomfortable feeling because the Ghostbusters were desperately trying to stay awake while slowly getting more exhausted. The audience also realized that no matter how hard they fought, humans simply could not stay awake forever. That pressure made the episode feel far more intense than a random ghost hunt. One unforgettable moment was seeing giant dream monsters destroying the city while ordinary people stayed asleep in their homes, completely helpless. The combination of giant nightmares and helpless people made the whole episode feel genuinely scary. It is easy to understand why this is remembered as one of the scariest episodes, because it turns something basic like sleep into something dangerous and impossible to avoid. Samhain. Samhain was probably the single most iconic villain in The Real Ghostbusters. Even people who barely remember the show usually remember the giant pumpkin-headed spirit standing against the night sky. And to be honest, his design alone deserved a spot on the list. Samhain appeared as this tall, cloaked figure with a glowing jack-o'-lantern head and burning eyes inside the pumpkin, and the combination of black robes and orange firelight made him look less like a normal ghost and more like an ancient god of Halloween itself, which he basically is. Samhain controlled groups of spirits and monsters while trying to create an eternal Halloween night. He wanted endless darkness, endless fear, and endless chaos. While that concept sounds cool as a horror fan, as a kid it felt really unsettling, and the idea that the night would never end again was surprisingly scary. What also separated Samhain from many other villains was his ancient mythological presence. He did not really feel like some random haunting. He felt old, powerful, and unstoppable, almost like something humans have feared for centuries. The imagery throughout his episodes was fantastic. Ghosts flooding the streets, glowing pumpkins everywhere, supernatural storms filling the sky, and Samhain himself standing above the city commanding it all, like the king of Halloween. One especially memorable scene was when Samhain stood against the moonlit sky while ghosts surrounded him, and that whole moment looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Over the years, Samhain became one of the franchise's most beloved villains because he perfectly balanced spooky fun with genuine horror. The Grundle. This episode becomes much scarier once you are older and realize how predatory the Grundle actually was. Visually, the Grundle was horrifying. It was tall, hunched, thin, with sickly skin, long claws, glowing eyes, sharp teeth, and this disgusting grin that always felt manipulative. He moved like a creature constantly lurking in the shadows, waiting for vulnerable children, and that is exactly what he used to do. The Grundle specifically targeted lonely, angry, or emotionally troubled kids. He whispered to them through windows, he encouraged bad behavior, and slowly manipulated them over time. The more negativity the children embraced, the more they physically transformed into creatures like him. The transformation aspect was what made the episode so terrifying, as kids were not just being haunted, they were becoming monsters themselves. Watching a child slowly develop sharp features, strange skin, and monstrous behavior created genuine body horror. There was also this horrible feeling that the process was emotional as much as it was physical. The children lost parts of their humanity the more they kept falling under the Grundle's influence. From a modern perspective, the Grundle had an extremely disturbing manipulative vibe as he isolated vulnerable kids emotionally and corrupted them slowly, and that predatory energy made him far scarier than many simple monster villains. One unforgettable moment was when the transformation became obvious and the child slowly started looking less human, which was very shocking for a kid's cartoon. Even today, it is easy to see why The Grundle is remembered as one of the darkest and most uncomfortable episodes in the entire franchise. The People Busters. Flipside was one of the most unsettling episodes in the entire franchise because it took something familiar and twisted it into something deeply wrong. The Ghostbusters discovered an alternate dimension called the Flipside, where humans were considered ghosts. In that world, ghosts had ruled the society while humans were the hunted monsters, and People Busters were the ones enforcing that system. The People Busters were basically distorted mirror versions of the Ghostbusters themselves. They resembled undead ghost caricatures of the heroes, with twisted appearances and exaggerated features that made them feel very uncanny rather than funny. That is what made them feel so disturbing. Kids had already trusted the Ghostbusters as heroes. Now suddenly, seeing similar silhouettes transformed into creepy authoritarian hunters created instant discomfort. The entire Flipside dimension also felt very dark and uncomfortable. New York looked darker, stranger, and more depressing than normal. Familiar places suddenly felt wrong, and it felt like stepping into a nightmare version of reality, where everything had been reversed. The idea itself was also really creepy, as humans were forced into hiding, while Ghost Society hunted them the same way the Ghostbusters normally hunted spirits. One memorable scene was when the Ghostbusters first realized humans were feared in this universe, and watching frightened citizens react to them like dangerous monsters had completely flipped the normal formula of the series. It is easy to see why Flipside works as one of the psychologically creepiest episodes, because it turned the entire Ghostbusters concept upside down. Cthulhu. I still cannot believe that the Real Ghostbusters basically brought Cthulhu into a Saturday morning cartoon. Technically, the episode calls him Cthulhu, but the connection to H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos is obvious. For kids who did not know anything about H.P. Lovecraft, this episode was probably their first exposure to cosmic horror. And to be honest, It is wild that this even exists. Visually, Cthulhu looked massive and horrifying. He had giant tentacles, glowing eyes, huge wings, enormous claws, and that classic eldritch design towering over everything around him. And that scale alone made him terrifying because the Ghostbusters suddenly felt tiny and powerless. The episode also leaned heavily into cult imagery and forbidden rituals. And it doesn't end there. There are also robed followers trying to summon this ancient entity using dark magic and mysterious texts, and the atmosphere feels far more adult than most episodes of the show. What makes Cthulhu terrifying is the concept behind him. Most ghosts in the series can eventually be trapped, but Cthulhu felt different. He had this ancient and unstoppable feeling attached to him. It felt as if humanity was insignificant compared to him, and that is purely Lovecraftian horror right there. There is also this constant sense that the proton packs would not be enough. Usually the Ghostbusters were confident, but against Cthulhu, they seemed genuinely overwhelmed. One unforgettable moment was when Cthulhu rose from the ocean and the sheer scale of the creature, combined with the dark stormy atmosphere, made it feel apocalyptic. Even today, it still feels insane that the Real Ghostbusters casually introduced children to cosmic horror mythology. The Headless Motorcyclist. This episode basically takes the legend of the Headless Horseman and modernizes it to an urban ghost story. Here, instead of the horse, you get a roaring motorcycle tearing through the streets at night. And honestly, that visual alone was quite terrifying. The Headless Motorcyclist wears black biker gear, heavy boots, leather gloves, and rides this loud, ghostly motorcycle through dark roads and alleyways. But the real horror, obviously, is the missing head. The animators constantly emphasized the empty space above the jacket collar, which made the character feel very unnatural every time he appeared on screen. The motorcycle itself also added to the fear factor. You could hear it approaching before you actually saw the ghost, and that buildup created tension in a way many kids' cartoons did not even attempt. Like most vengeful spirits, the motorcyclist could phase through objects, appear suddenly, and relentlessly pursue targets. He had that classic unstoppable slasher energy, where running away barely helped. What made him even scarier from a kid's perspective is how believable the urban legend felt like. And this is not some fantasy monster from another dimension. It felt like the kind of ghost story older kids would tell each other at sleepovers. The nighttime chase scenes especially stood out. Seeing the motorcycle speeding through dark streets while this headless figure closes in honestly felt more intense than many horror movies made for children. This episode is also a perfect example of how the Real Ghostbusters mixed folklore with modern aesthetics as they took an old myth and made it feel fresh and creepy for the 1980s. The Were-Chicken. Now, this one sounds ridiculous on paper, as a giant were-chicken should not be scary. It should be comedy. But somehow, the Real Ghostbusters turned this episode into one of the strangest and most uncomfortable transformations in the series. The story becomes weirdly disturbing when a were-chicken egg hatches at the firehouse and the creature bites Egon, slowly mutating him into a half-man, half-chicken monster. And to be honest, the scariest part is not even the final creature. It is the transformation itself. Visually, the were-chicken looked grotesque. Huge feathers, distorted limbs, giant claws, yellow eyes, and this oversized, twisted beak that made the whole thing look unnatural. But again, the real horror came from the gradual changes, and watching somebody slowly lose control of their body is classic horror movie material. The episode plays the transformation surprisingly straight. Egon becomes more aggressive, more animalistic, and less human over time. And as a kid, that idea is unsettling because it feels unstoppable. Once the mutation starts, there is no easy way to actually stop it. There is also something deeply uncomfortable about body horror in children's cartoons, because kids are not really used to seeing the human body changing in disturbing ways. The episode almost feels like a toned-down version of movies like The Fly or classic werewolf stories. One especially memorable scene is when the transformation really begins to accelerate and Egon starts panicking while physically changing. Even though the concept is really silly, the execution makes it weirdly disturbing. This episode became memorable precisely because it balanced comedy and horror in a very awkward way. Like, you are laughing at the idea of a giant chicken, but at the same time the transformation scenes are genuinely creepy. the troll. And lastly, we have a monster that takes one of the oldest childhood fears imaginable and turns it into something actually creepy. Troll Bridge plays with the classic monster under the bridge fear, but the actual story has a funny Ghostbusters twist. One troll runs off into the city while the other trolls seize the Queensboro Bridge and threaten New York unless he is returned. Visually, these trolls looked huge and nasty as well. They had massive arms, rough rocky skin, giant claws, glowing eyes, and faces that looked permanently angry. The animators made them feel less like funny fantasy creatures and more like things that actually lived in the dark, waiting for people to show up. Whenever the trolls appeared around the bridge, the atmosphere instantly became uncomfortable. Their powers were pretty simple, but effective. Super strength, durability, and the classic nobody crosses my bridge mentality. But to be honest, what made them scary was not really complexity. It was the idea itself. As a kid, bridges are a normal thing. You cross them all the time without thinking too much about it. But then this episode suddenly makes you wonder, what if there actually is something hiding underneath? That is why the troll works so well. It taps directly into that fairy tale fear children already know, and that is the monster under the bridge is not just a story anymore. It is real, gigantic, and angry. One memorable moment is when the troll suddenly emerges from the darkness beneath the bridge, and the size of the creature compared to the humans made the scene feel way more intense than you would expect from a cartoon. Comparing it to higher entries, the troll is a more straightforward creature horror rather than psychological terror, but for younger viewers, it was still nightmare fuel. Achira. Now, let's talk about when Extreme Ghostbusters arrived in the late 90s. The series became noticeably darker and more terrifying. And to be honest, Achira was one of the best examples of how much darker the series had become, because she didn't feel like a goofy ghost cartoon villain at all. In fact, she felt like pure evil. Visually, Achira appeared as a giant supernatural figure surrounded by darkness, and parts of her body almost blended into shadows, while glowing eyes and strange symbols stood out in the darkness. And sometimes she did not even look fully solid, which made her feel even creepier. Her threat was terrifying because Achira was a dangerous disease-spreading entity who was released by subway workers, possessed by Kylie Griffin, infected Egon, and made the entire city feel like it was sliding into supernatural collapse. What made Achira especially scary was the atmosphere of the two-part episode. The story constantly escalated. Things kept on getting worse, darker, and more hopeless. Unlike some of the earlier Ghostbusters episodes that had balanced horror with comedy, this one felt genuinely heavy. The use of darkness itself was also very effective, and the darkness was also one of the oldest fears that children had, and this episode had weaponized it perfectly. Entire locations felt swallowed by shadow, while the new Ghostbusters were trying to survive their first major supernatural crisis. One memorable part of the story showed the city falling under Achira's threat, while the characters desperately tried to survive and fight back. The visuals felt closer to a supernatural horror movie than a normal cartoon. Achira also proved that Extreme Ghostbusters was willing to push horror even darker than the original show sometimes did. Looking back now, it is honestly amazing how far the Real Ghostbusters and Extreme Ghostbusters were willing to push horror for children's television. These shows did not just cash in on a popular movie franchise, they gave kids closet monsters like the Boogieman, dream demons like the Sandman, corrupted children through the Grundle, ancient Halloween gods like Samhain, and even Lovecraftian cosmic horror with Cthulhu. Now that is some insane kind of nightmare fuel for Saturday morning cartoons. But now I want to know your picks. Which Ghostbusters monsters scared you the most growing up? And did we miss any nightmare fuel ghosts from the animated series? Make sure to like, subscribe, comment your choice below, and also suggest more Ghostbusters topics like the scariest Extreme Ghostbusters episode or the most powerful entities in the Ghostbusters lore.